Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar on modular manufacture and point of care regulations. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You've joined the presentation listening using your computer's speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You'll have the opportunity to submit text questions via Slido at www.slido.com using the event code #pointofcare25. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Please note that we will not be accepting questions via the GoToWebinar chat function. It is now my pleasure to introduce your first speaker, Ian Rees, Assessor, MHRA.
Hello everybody, and I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining this webinar on decentralized manufacturing, which we'll explain a little bit, covers modular manufacturing and point of care to give it UK terminology. So just to clarify that we have a few aims in this webinar. Clearly one of them is information sharing. We'd like to give you an update on the progress that we've been making and also progress that we've been making with international regulators as well. And then, as you'll hear from me and several of my colleagues who are working closely on this, what the next steps are. So to give you the agenda, so this is the first session and that I'll be covering. You'll also hear a little bit more from me on some of the background, where this has come from, some of the events, how we've got to where we are today, and some of the key features of the activities, and that's primarily myself, but also my colleague Elspeth, and then we'll be going through the GXP aspects, authorization, then there'll be a Q&A session, and then I'll do a summary and just introduce the next steps. So, and next slide, please. So just to give you a little bit of background, I'm sure you know quite a bit about the MHRA. So next slide, please. So we're the UK medicines, devices and blood for transfusion regulator. And so we have a key responsibility in ensuring that these products are meet the appropriate standards, they are safe, of the right appropriate quality and efficacious. And that's quite a challenge. As we're moving forward, things are developing, and as a regulator, clearly we can't stand still, so we need to keep moving forward, and we do this in conjunction with other regulators in the UK and also the international group of regulators, and there are several fora for that. So next slide, please. So you've probably seen this in the various documents that the MHRA puts out, business plan and so on, and there are quite a few elements here. Pretty much everything really is touched on by the work that we are doing today as an exemplar of all of these aspects. So clearly we have to make sure that, and we're focused on medicines here, meet the applicable standards and they're safe, appropriate quality and efficacious. The top right box, you'll see there that we're here also to support innovation and research. The UK is a great place to do research, and the MHRA is part of the translation pathway to get that to patients. And so supporting innovation is absolutely key, and so this decentralized manufacturing is a great exemplar of that. Communication and transparency, hopefully you'll agree that we'll have met that today. And the communication, the way the text is there, it sounds like it's just communication from us, but actually it's two-way communication, and that's absolutely key. The international standardization and harmonization, although that's typically tending to be more the testing, but working with international regulators is absolutely key. Ensuring safe supply chains, you'll see from today that the supply chains in this context will look quite a bit different, but that's absolutely fine. And it's absolutely key to be on the front foot when there are changes to be made to make sure that we're fully engaged and that these also are safe and get to the correct patients in the normal way. The bottom right, collaborating with partners in the UK, quite a wide range of partners, clearly quite a few regulators, but also others as well that clearly NHS, other healthcare professionals. So there's a very wide range of partners in the UK. And as I mentioned, internationally, that's absolutely key. So perhaps if we just move on to the next slide, please. So here are mission and value vision. So world leading and an enabling sovereign regulator. That's absolutely key. And this is part of the, maybe you'll have heard the change in the position of the regulator, not a blocker at the end. It's an enabler and on part of the journey, bringing research through to clinical trials and onto licensed products so that patients get the benefit of that. So that's just by way of a revision of mission and vision. So perhaps with that, we can move on to the next slide. So here I'm just going to give you, for some of you who've been on this journey with us for quite some time, you'll know some of this, but this is just a little synopsis of the journey that we've been on. So next slide, please. So the next click. Thank you. So where does this come from? It's really all down to engagement by the various mechanisms that we have at MHRA. So the Innovation Office, now part of the Innovation Accelerator, inquiries coming through at a slightly later stage through scientific advice meetings. So in addition to dealing with these inquiries, providing answers and clarifications, they're also part of the horizon scanning mechanism that the MHRA has. And I suppose I would describe this perhaps not primary horizon scanning, just looking at new science and research, but more applied, just seeing what people are actually doing. And as a result of that, what does MHRA need to do that may be different? So next click, please. So what we're trying to do here is to support, and I've got some slides to show you what this broadened range of manufacturing and supply options are. So this is intended to complement the existing, of course, centralized manufacturing and supply that have been the standard model of medicine supply for a long period of time. What we want to do in making those changes is to make sure that control measures that are in place will provide the equivalent levels of quality, safety and efficacy for products manufactured and supplied in different circumstances. And we are adding to the current framework, and so it needs to fit in. But one of the messages that came through very clearly from the original public consultation that we did a few years ago now was to introduce some legal tests just to avoid confusion and duplication. And this is something that we've heard very clearly, and you'll see later on that how we've done that. Once you've recognized the change, it doesn't stop there, it keeps changing. So what we want to do then is to accommodate future developments and that's quite tricky. And there was a quote from a Nobel laureate, Niels Bohr, who said that prediction, especially about the future, is very difficult. In other words, you're not quite sure what's going to come, but by staying close to the people who are at the different parts of that development process, then we can try and stay connected to that. And you'll see we've tried to make the changes enabling and also, another word, enduring. So next click, please. And so these changes then are to the full range of medicinal products, from gases, biologics, biotech, ATMPs, and small molecules. So it's trying to be, so it's not, although it typically falls down to a few types of products, but this is absolutely applicable right across the dosage spectrum. Next slide, please. So just to give you an overview, so next click. So we're just going to look at it from two aspects, from the development of the framework and also the legal changes that we needed to make. And next click, please. So in terms of the framework development, this goes back quite a few years, and although we try to be agile, some of these changes, particularly where they involve legal text, do take quite a lot of working out, and there are certain procedures that go with that, which I'll explain in a second. Of course, you'll all remember the COVID pandemic, and so that took up quite a chunk of the early stages of those dark green arrows there. So the first couple of workshops, for example, were done virtually rather than in person. But as I mentioned, right at the beginning is all the engagement by yourselves, inquiries to the Innovation Office and scientific advice meetings. Once we recognized that there was some inquiries which didn't really fit the current model of manufacture and supply, we then started to put these disparate issues together and challenged them internally and with other regulators, but also then started to shape these through the couple of workshops that were back in 2020. That allowed us to put a proposed framework together where we had an event in 2021, and many of you, I'm sure, were part of that. That really allowed us to finesse the framework, but it's all part of the shaping as we move forward. We realized we had to have legal changes, so that requires us then to have a public consultation. Then we had clearly to assess replies and publish a response, which was done in early 2023. So if we could just have the next click, please. And so at that time, some of you may remember the Medicines and Medical Devices Act, which allowed changes to human and veterinary medicines and also medical devices. So it gave MHRA the power and also the VMD for veterinary medicines. So once we'd really shaped the framework, looked at the feedback from the consultation, that then directly fed into the legal changes that we needed to make, and changes to other documents as well, as you'll hear a little bit more about. So you'll have probably heard that the legislation was actually laid on the 21st of October, and it's been signed into law. For those of you that look on the legislation.gov, it's still showing that particular document. So we're expecting that to be finalized fairly shortly. But the key point is it's been signed into law on the 23rd of January. There's now a 6 month coming into effect, which I think there should be an arrow on another click, perhaps. Yes, that's right. So middle of the year, about 23rd of July, this legislation comes into effect. So what we're doing now, and you'll see on the top side of the arrows, we're developing technical and process guidance for right across the GXPs, legislation, process guidance, website, and so on. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So that's where we are at the moment. And that key arrow at the bottom is to make sure that all stakeholder engagements, other regulators, both national and international, this is a key and ongoing part of the process. So next slide, please. So and one more click, please. Thank you. So just representing the translation pathway as a technology readiness level. So we try to map broadly the key steps of that translation process. And next step, please. Next click. Thank you. This is typically where the legislation applies towards the end of preclinical studies. And then there's all the things that we know about inspections, assessment, pharmacovigilance, and so on. And within that, we have support and acceleration mechanisms, so ILAP, EAMS, and so on, plus scientific advice meetings. So, but there's a gap you'll see from discovery. So next click. This is where the innovation office comes in. This is where the inquiries that we see, and this is absolutely key to have that engagement. That gives us, as I mentioned earlier, the horizon scanning capabilities. So not only do we address the issues, hopefully, but then we can look at these holistically and say, here are a series of inquiries which don't seem to fit. They're actually quite challenging to deal with, but then you realize what's actually needed. And there was quite a bit of work, which included legislative changes and guidance changes, which is where we are now. So another click, please. So having seen these changes, you then have to decide what are we going to do about them, and are they actionable in some way? And so you can have that from the very early stages, which is where decentralized manufacturing, that's the arrow that's going forward. Clearly, you can have changes that you see later in the drug development process, which means you might have to go back. So, and next slide, please. So this is just an illustration. So regulation is made up of two parts. There's the legislative framework, and then the regulatory guidance documents in their many and varied form that underpin and interpret those. So next click, please. So you can see that where there's changes which are more of the same, perhaps scale up or something like that, there's no need to change any guidance or legislation. So the next click, please. Once something then starts to change, technology keeps moving forward, then we'd have to make changes. So with apologies to those that are not in GMP, these are GMP type changes. So you'll know all the changes in Annex 1 in Europe and PICS. And the next click. So once you start to get more disruptive, it isn't just a matter of updating a guidance, you have to create some new guidance. So ICHQ 13 on continuous manufacturing. And then when you get much more then towards the disruptive end of the scale, not only do you have to create new guidance, but you've actually got to adapt the legislation as well. And when you have something that's that you have to do all of that, it tends to mean that it doesn't just fit in to the existing manufacturing and supply models. So the institutions that are involved, and there's many and varied, and I'll give a little bit more information on that, you have to give that extra element, that institutional readiness. So this is a concept that some will know well, and others it may be fairly new. So next slide, please. So this is a slide which tries to encompass quite a broad range of things. And next click, please. So this is the current situation where most products tend to be more at the mass market end of the scale. They're manufactured typically at large scale, but they don't necessarily. They're relatively stable, which means then that you can scale up. And so you need a relatively small number of sites. So we tend to refer to these collectively as centralized manufacturing, and they can be big or small, some in hospitals and so on. So that's the model that we currently have. So next click shows then the spectrum of things that we're introducing here. And you'll see there's a range from the left. That's the modular manufacture, or sometimes known as pod or portable on demand, where modules can either be moved or installed, and they can go to different factories. They can be perhaps co-located near a healthcare center, or perhaps used in a military field station type situation. And then as you move away from factory, you've got not just relocatable modular units, but mobile units, i.e. something on wheels. Then you move forward to those that are the original concept of what we saw in the inquiries, actually manufacture literally at the bedside, in the operating theatre, or potentially in military situations And finally, we've seen applications, and this is where the value of inquiries is key, because it shines a light into corners that you perhaps didn't even knew existed, let alone have any details on. Some home-based manufacture, and this links very nicely with the NHS concept of virtual wards. So you're now down at the other end of the scale, single person, a batch N of 1, very short shelf life, sometimes extremely short, less than a minute, but some a bit more generous at 20 minutes. So what that means then is you have to manufacture this where the patient is and when that patient is present. And the next click. So just to illustrate then the terminology, so modular, with no surprise there, modular manufacture, so you'll hear that terminology, and then point of care, that's the collective for mobile, the true healthcare point of care, and home-based manufacturing. And those together then we refer to decentralized manufacturing, and this aligns with quite a lot of terminology that our international regulatory partners are using. So next slide, please. So all of these are predicated on a hub and spoke model. So the next slide, next click, please. So you'll see there, so what we have is at the center, the mothership, if you will, is the control site. And it should do what it says on the tin. It should provide the necessary controls. And if you think of the control site as a manufacturing site with all its normal functions without any manufacturing, because that's devolved to one or more local manufacturing sites, whether they're point of care or modular. One of the key responsibilities and new concepts we've introduced, and my colleague Elspeth will talk a little bit more about this, is the master file concept. So in coming up with this model, what we did, we looked at other regulatory models in closely allied areas, such as blood for transfusion, tissue transplant devices, and so on, and some within medicines themselves. So this concept is in large part an adaptation of the plasma master file system. So it's borrow some concepts from there, borrow some concepts from blood for transfusion, and some for tissue transplant. So we know that they work in those sort of concepts, and so we've adapted them here. And part of this is to make it enabling so that it allows things to happen, but also proportionate to the changed circumstances. So, and we'll show you a little bit more of some of the changes that we've brought about. And the intent then is that this fits in, as I mentioned before, with current models of regulation. So it supports clinical trial authorization, marketing authorization. And then in terms of inspections, so I've referred primarily here to GMP, but it also links in with the other XPs, so GCP and pharmacovigilance. So the intent would be to routinely inspect control sites to make sure they're in control, and then to verify that control by an inspections on an as-needed basis on a proportion of the point of care or modular manufacturing sites. And work will be done, and you'll hear a little bit more from GCP and pharmacovigilance colleagues that all of those are fully applicable to this. So a little bit more then, so next slide, please. Thank you. So just on point of care, so in order to try to be enabling, although these products typically have a short shelf life, it doesn't necessarily mean that all of those with the technology moving forward, there may be other compelling reasons why these things have to be made at the point of care. So as I mentioned before, these are pretty short, so less than 20 minutes, and in some cases less than a minute. So for those, you have no choice but to manufacture, say, where and when the patient is there. So it means an intermittent style of manufacture rather than ongoing manufacture, where some line is dedicated. a large number of sites, and some sites that are quite novel and different, so on the ward, in the operating theatre, and so on. So we introduced a legal test, and I'll reiterate this in a little while, that rather than tie it to one type of approach at a short shelf life, what we've introduced in the legal test is that these can only be manufactured at or near the place where the products to be used are administered. So we've seen some which have to be made in the operating theatre. So it's almost a procedure that's more akin to almost going to the dentist to have a filling, while you're being local anaesthetic and hopefully the right tooth drilled. Somebody's preparing the amalgam. So it's that more akin to that, but it's still medicines manufacture. Next slide, please. Similarly then for modular or portable on demand type manufacturing. So these then are more like factory type manufacturing scenarios. So it's not limited to short shelf life or perhaps other compelling reasons why they would have to be made at point of care. And the test that we've introduced is for reasons relating to deployment. So this would be perhaps some examples could be where you've got to synchronize very closely the manufacture of the product and the preparation of the patient, perhaps some immune ablation. Clearly, that's key to make sure that the product is available. So we've opened that definition up a little bit more broadly, but it's still a legal test. So next slide, please. So a little bit about the legislation. We won't go into big depth, but as it is at the moment, you'll see when you go onto legislation.gov that the SI is still 2024-000. This reflects that it was laid back in 2024. We're expecting very soon that it'll move to 2025 and then whatever the next number in sequence was. The key thing then that it was signed into law on 23rd of January, so 6 months hence. That's when it'll come into effect. And there's the front page of that legislation. You'll see it amends the HMRs and the clinical trials regs. And when you go onto that website, you'll see there's other documents there, such as explanatory memoranda. So that's a fairly plain English explanation of the policy intent and what it covers, what it doesn't cover, and so on. So quite a digestible read as these things go. So next slide, please. So just to pick up some of the key elements, and next click. So what we wanted, and I mentioned before, is for this to be enabling and enduring and proportionate. So enabling, it allows things to happen. Enduring, the last thing we want to do is to be changing legislation every year. So there's a risk here. If you put detail in, you get legal certainty. The problem is that with technology moving forward, it'll be out of date fairly quickly. And proportionate, I'll explain that in a minute. So to be enabling and enduring, so high-level provisions, so to provide a coherent legal framework which fits in with HMRs and clinical trials regs, but then details in guidance. So you'll hear more about guidance in a minute. That we're developing, but that interpretive guidance is something that you can adapt and update relatively quickly. And the proportionality to meet the current requirements and suits the needs of decentralized manufacturing. So, for example, you know that you normally name the site of manufacture. Well, clearly, if you're manufacturing on a ward or in an operating theatre, you're not going to specify operating theatre number 1 and what happens if tomorrow it's operating theatre number 5. So some simplification there. So next click, please. And I mentioned before, one of the clear feedback messages was to avoid undermining the current model of manufacture. So to try and give some certainty and avoid duplication and confusion, we've put in legal tests. And just to reiterate them here, for point of care, these we've tried to generalize it as much as we can. It can only be manufactured at or near the place of manufacture. So it's not a choice. So the default manufacturing is still factory-based, but if you can only manufacture it there, then point of care is your legal option. Modular manufacture, this is, say, slightly broader. So these are products that could otherwise be made in a factory, but for reasons relating to deployment, like, for example, synchronizing the manufacture and supply with perhaps preparation of patient, might also have application in early stages of pandemic when there could be compelling reasons to deploy those early stages, and perhaps through scale out, perhaps give some capacity options as well. So next slide, please. And one more click. So there are certain things that we had to create. So a control site, as I mentioned, so that's some terminology that's new. And so essentially, this is the mothership. This is what supervises and controls all the manufacturing assembly at those remote sites of manufacturing, whether they be point of care or modular manufacturing. And I mentioned a master file, which Elspeth will describe shortly. This is the detailed description of the arrangements, not just for how you actually bring on board new sites, but perhaps decommission and so on. And next click, please. So this control site is the only one that will be listed on the manufacturing authorization. So in terms of proportionality, if there's a control mechanism and the master file is that thing, that's how you legally are allowed to manufacture at the point of care or modular manufacture, because it'll be named in an active part of the master file. When you retire sites, it'll go into a decommissioned list, but that traceability of activity will still be there. And then the requirement to list the sites of manufacture that currently will require perhaps an MA variation, that's been switched off so that it'll be covered in the master file. And the next click, please. Thank you. So this is part of that proportionality. So for routine, if I can call it, changes, adding new sites, decommissioning sites, this will be managed through the control site and the master file. And we've introduced a piece of text which describes changes that are a material alteration, other things that you notify us. So examples of that would be a change to named personnel, or perhaps indeed the location of the control site itself. So next slide, please. A note on international. So this is not something that's done solely by MHRA. We've been working closely either on a bilateral basis with a range of individual regulators, and this has been the journey that we've been on for the last, 8+ years. And then collectively through ICMHRA, the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Agencies. So we proposed this and it was voted on and accepted that it would be done through the innovation area of ICMHRA. So we had the Japanese agency who coordinated this, and it led to a workshop on 3rd of December. And you can see there were quite a lot of attendees from quite a range of regulatory authorities, some like the US and the EU that have got actions here, and others that don't yet have any actions but wanted to understand. And so we looked at 3 areas, so terminology definitions, this was led by US FDA, GXP technical aspects, this was led by MHRA, and then the CMC aspects. And so that report is due out, I think, next month, hopefully next month. Next slide, please. And finally, then, just a word on the international aspects, so institutional readiness aspects. I mentioned that for products and processes that are different, disruptive, the fact that we've used the word disruptive means it doesn't fit. It's not more tablets on a shelf in a pharmacy. It's not more vaccines in a fridge. Like ATMPs, the healthcare institutes are part of the process at both ends very often. And so certainly at the tail end, they definitely will be. And so these need to be part of the process. You can't, in a closely interrelated and complex system like medicine supply, is just make a change in one area and hope it's adopted by some kind of diffusion all the way down the line. You've got to manage that actively. So that's a role that MHRA is taking part. And this very neat concept of institutional readiness, so this contrast perhaps with technical readiness of the product, critical quality attributes and so on, and the automation and all those process understanding, that's technical readiness, regulatory readiness, which I've been describing, legal changes, guidance changes. So this is another pillar of that change, institutional readiness. So it can be quite a significant change for that organization or other regulator. So you see there a list, some exemplars of those that we are engaging with. And to say this goes back to an ESRC funded project by the late Andrew Webster. So it's been hugely valuable. So perhaps with that then, that's my last slide for now. I'll hand over then on the next slide to my colleague Elspeth Gray. Many of you will know Elspeth. She's an expert pharmaceutical assessor. So Elspeth.
Thank you very much indeed, Jan. So we've heard under this regulatory framework for decentralized manufacture, two product types are envisaged, point of care and modular. And this slide summarizes the definitions that sit within legislation. And indeed, you saw those in an earlier slide. But what I'd like to tease out is that it's key that there is a consultation with the MHRA. So essentially, the MHRA must agree that the product meets the legislative test. So to qualify for manufacture at point of care, the rationale must reflect that for reasons relating to method of manufacture, shelf life, this could be for an intermediate as well as the drug product, nature of the constituents or method or route of administration, it must be manufactured and administered in close proximity to the patient. Modular manufacture relates to manufacture or assembly in these modular units that are relocatable. Here the regulatory test is broader. It relates to reasons of deployment. We've had some examples from Jan. Other examples could be pandemic response rollout, or perhaps even the need to avoid a cryopreservation step that has been shown to confer a subsequent clinical benefit. In other words, that rationale must support scale out rather than scale up. Arguments solely relating to convenience for either the manufacturer or for the patient will not meet the regulatory tests. There must be elements that argue strongly for decentralized manufacture. So to summarize, decentralized manufacture requires that the MHRA has accepted the applicant's justification. We're considering a designation step to facilitate this, and we will be consulting on our proposed process and our guidance later this quarter. Next slide, please. So to enable the framework, a key mechanism, as we've heard, is the Decentralized Manufacture Master File, and I'm going to call it the DMMF. And this offers significant regulatory flexibilities. It's essentially a document. It captures product, process, procedural aspects. Particularly for point of care products, aspects of the control strategy are likely to depend upon surrogate process parameters that have been shown to be quality critical. And to facilitate this, an enhanced understanding of process and product characteristics will be expected. The DMMF, as we've heard, will also capture aspects such as the location and the status of manufacturing sites that are being administered by the control site. And for a product that's the subject of a marketing authorization, this means that onboarding, controlling, closing a site of manufacture will not require to be notified by variation, as the details are captured within the master file. Next slide, please. Some final considerations relating to the DMMF. A DMMF is envisaged as specific to a single product. And as it is a means to deliver important regulatory flexibilities, it requires maintenance as a live document. Annual reporting or submission on request is proposed. Again, the MHRA intends to consult with our stakeholders as to how this may operate. So I will now pass to my colleague Martin Powell, who will deal with some GMP considerations. Martin.
Thank you, Elspeth. So I'm going to have a discussion over just a couple of slides that I've got that talk about the aspects of controls that are expected with regards to GMP manufacturing sites and the licenses they hold. The new designation for manufacturing licenses will be a new, different product type, such as on existing licenses for steriles or non-sterile medicines or even biologics, and then broken down by a specific dosage form. So effectively, any new application or a license variation for an existing facility will need to have the modular manufacturing or point of care type added to their license. That addition of that new type of manufacturing process will trigger an inspection to assess the systems and compliance controls in coordination with the Decentralized Manufacturing Master File, the DMMF that's been mentioned. This approach applies not only to MIAs for commercial products, the MIA IMPs for clinical trials, and also the MS for specials or unlicensed products. We're going to be looking for the control site who is requesting this new format to be added to their license to have their quality systems in order to show that they can control this new type of product. So, for example, they need to show through their quality system that they've got an approach to equipment and process qualification when they're considering how do they implement a new modular site somewhere remote from the control centre. How are they going to look at training personnel that might be remote from the control centre, whether they're employed by themselves or potentially using staff from that new modular unit? How are they going to manage the decentralised master file, the DMMF itself? What's expected of it? How are they going to keep that up to date? How are they going to ensure that they're monitoring and managing sites as they come on and come off that DMMF document? And what are they going to do in terms of ensuring that they provide to the agency, to the MHRA, an annual submission of their updates? The quality system will also need to look at how they're going to address the local release processes. What will be the oversight from the qualified person for commercial or clinical trial products? Now, we're not expecting, because it might be a 1-minute product, for the QP to be there in person every time. But how are they going to ensure there's going to be a consistent process for the immediate release that can be followed up by a subsequent review? In the slide that we've got up here at the moment, I've talked about various regulations from the legislation, and I'll do that through some of the following slides, as will my colleagues. So what we're trying to do is give you an indication where information can be found to help you set up these processes. Next slide, please. The key from this slide is that manufacturing sites need to have both an approved and issued manufacturing license that includes that point of care or modular manufacturing operation and an approved DMMF in order to be able to manufacture and release the related point of care and modular manufacturing products. As I've mentioned, the DM approach can be applied to specials or unlicensed products, but there's still a need for the DMMF to be in place and to have an oversight of that. But to be honest, at this point, the approval and assessment process for the DMMF for specials products remains under discussion. So that's a very quick canter through some of the specific legislations linked to the GMP and manufacturing. And there is more detail in the legislation that gives indications of what we are looking for bullet by bullet, and we're going to expand that through guidance. So a very short overview, and I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Claire Longman, who's the expert PV inspector, who'll go over some of the pharmacovigilance parts.
Thanks very much, Martine. Hi, everybody. Yes, as Martine says, I'm going to take you through some of the pharmacovigilance points to consider. I'm also joined online by my colleague Alison Shaw, who's from our benefit risk evaluation department. So if you have any questions on pharmacovigilance afterwards, we'll both be there to answer those. So I'm going to start with covering some of the points for authorised products. And for these, there really hasn't been too much that's been updated for decentralised manufacture in terms of pharmacovigilance for authorised products, but there are some points to consider. In terms of pharmacovigilance, these products will continue to follow the pharmacovigilance regulations set out in the Human Medicines Regulation 2012 Part 11, the Commission implementing Regulation 520 2012, and what's been transposed into the HMR Schedule 12A, and then we have the GVP modules and the exceptions and modifications document. So we continue to expect that pharmacovigilance will follow those. But there are some specific points that you'll need to consider in terms of these type of products because of how they are manufactured. And I'll go through some of those. So starting off with the collection and collation of adverse events and events of special interest, you'll need to make sure that you have mechanisms in place to identify those adverse events. And that is a stipulation now, but with these type of medicines, obviously you've got the introduction of the control site, and you'll have to make sure that adverse events are travelling from the healthcare professional who may be manufacturing the product in these terms and bringing those events into the PV system. And therefore we've got to think of things like your contracts and agreements and your oversight mechanisms on those contracts agreements, any safety data exchange agreements that are needed, reconciliation that you may need, and bringing those sites into your audit risk assessment also. In terms of management of ADRs, there has been an update to the regulation for this, and HMR Part 11 Regulation 187/188 talks about collecting the batch number or other product identifier in terms of ADRs for decentralized manufactured products. So as well as having mechanisms to be able to collect those, you need to make sure that the people who are running the pharmacovigilance system understand that that is a requirement, and also you've got follow-up mechanisms to ensure that batch information is received. And if it hasn't, how are you going to prompt the reporters to get that information? In terms of signal detection, this is there have been some points to consider in terms of this due to the nature of, again, the manufacturing. So things around the frequency of the signal detection that you're following. The frequency of those exercises will need to be shorter, and this is to enable you to identify any significant issues with the manufacturing and any batch and specific site issues. So it will also need to be done on that specific site basis, not just on an active substance level. And that means that there may be some more additions to think about in terms of any talking with the manufacturing sites and passing on specific information to them, transferring knowledge on batch specific issues between pharmacovigilance and manufacturing. And then just to finish with a couple of points around the pharmacovigilance system master file and the qualified person for pharmacovigilance. With the qualified person for pharmacovigilance, it's important that they have oversight and knowledge that the organisation has these type of products, and that needs to be known to them at the stage of application. And that's so that they can start to put provisions in place for the pharmacovigilance system, and some of those provisions that we've said in terms of contracts and agreements, looking at how audits will be done and that kind of thing. There'll also need to be good links between the qualified person for pharmacovigilance and manufacturing, perhaps the responsible person, to share those quality issues and batch-specific information. And then also on the pharmacovigilance system master file, or the PSMF as it's known, we will be expecting information to be included that you have these type of products, but also a list of the control sites and the manufacturing site list, because these will be sources of adverse event information potentially. Next slide, please. So just touching briefly on the updates for pharmacovigilance for specials and EAMS products. So there has been an update to the regulation for specials medicines, and this has been the introduction of regulation 170A and 170B, and this stipulates that you need to, one, collect the batch number for any ADRs that are reported, and details of that suspected ADR, but also you'll need to submit not just your serious reports to the MHRA, but also the non-serious ADRs as well. And just to note, for these type of products, in addition, the HMR does state that a risk management system may be required. Now, that is something that's already stipulated for specials, but given the nature of these products, the likelihood of them requiring a risk management system is a lot higher. And then finally, early access to EAMS. There has been an update to regulation 167G within the HMR, and this is to ensure the collection and reporting of the batch number with any ADRs. So I'm going to hand over to Jason Wakeling-Smith, who is the expert inspector for GCP.
Thanks, Claire. So I'm going to pick up a little bit about GCP. So in some respects, a decentralized method of manufacture doesn't fundamentally change how you're going to run your clinical trial, or certainly not from how the regulations work. What there is a real need for is to be really clear about how it's going to function within that clinical trial. So we always talk about the protocol being king. And with that in mind, there's real aspects here about IMP management, about how you're going to handle the medication, how it's going to be given, and then how the decentralized part of things sort of fits with that all together. So you've got that bit. You've also got how the risks are going to be managed. So these days it's all about risk and what that means for your clinical trial. So how are you going to manage the risks associated with decentralized manufacture, and then also mitigate those risks and be really clear that you've got control of that aspect of it. And then finally, depending on what your product is, what particular aspects do you need to bear in mind associated with that? So does it need a particular way of working? Does it need a particular setup in order to administer it? All those kind of things. Fairly unique within the rest of the manufacturing side of things is that you have blinding within clinical trials, and certainly you're going to need to work out how to manage blinding depending on the product and how it's going to be manufactured. But is that a sham procedure? Is that something you still put through the machine that does the manufacturing step? All of those kind of things. How are you going to manage that? Because that's really important. And then finally, patients are the responsibility of the investigator, and decentralized manufacture doesn't change that at all. But how is that investigator going to have awareness and oversight of what's going on with the IMP at their site, at the spoke site? Is a team of people coming in, and if there is, how does that function? How does that work? What control does the investigator have, or are they somewhat pushed to one side because of this new product? So ultimately, there are plenty of things to think about, which are slightly different than just sort of, in inverted commas, the normal use of a medicine. At that point, I'll hand you over to Govind Barra from our clinical trials unit.
Thanks very much, Jason. Right, I'm going to talk for a couple of minutes about the quality dossier requirements for CTA and MAA submissions. So the good news is that the general quality dossier requirements for decentralized manufactured products remains aligned with the common technical document. This is to aid the efficiency of compilation of both CTAs and MAAs. It is, however, expected that some CTAs will require additional development information in the IMPD when compared to conventionally manufactured IMPs. The additional information required will vary from case to case. In general terms, companies should address aspects such as any risks that are inherent to the dosage form or its intended route of administration, any complexities that may arise from the product's design or its manufacturing process, or perhaps even the manufacturing environment. There may be variabilities that may be present in the drug substance or the finished drug product batches. So starting to think about and addressing these sorts of aspects early during development, I think, is key. Similar information will also be required should the IMP progress to the MAA stage. We would encourage enhanced development approaches and their associated control strategies. There are established guidances which should be followed where applicable, such as those for process validation, real-time release testing, quality by design, and process analytical technology, and there are others. Just a final comment about post-approval change management tools. These are valuable assets and they may be applicable to some of these products, decentralized manufactured products. These are more common at the MAA stage, but the methodology can be applied to clinical trial authorization applications in the same way, provided sufficient supporting information has been provided. Thank you very much.
Thanks for handling that section. So just to go then to the next steps and the summary, so perhaps if you can just put that up. So first of all, I'll just put a pictorial up, quite like pictures. So this is a summary of where we are now. So we've had the laying in Parliament, the signing into law, and then coming into effect with that green line in 6 months' time in July. This is the first webinar. And you'll see from the next click, please, you'll see some other activities. So we've been working on the technical guidances. There's more to do, and the Q&As were very valuable in maybe sharpening our thinking or guiding us to new areas. And what we're planning to do, you'll see there's a little I square button there. We'll talk about that in a minute. There's going to be a workshop, so an in-person workshop on the 12th of March. The admin guidelines, this is in part what Elspeth was talking about. This is the process, how you apply the designation step and so on. And what we're intending to do then is to publish those guidelines, whether technical or administrative. And by the way, the technical guidelines are supplementary to existing guidelines. So those that are familiar with GMP will know, for example, that annexes supplement the basic parts of GMP. So this would supplement the existing guidelines. So that's the general approach. What we're then trying to do then is have those published in good time, about at least a month ahead of the coming into effect. And during that period before it comes into effect is to have a second webinar just to give an update on progress, let everybody know where everything is located, including a new site on the MHRA website. Just then briefly, just to reiterate on ICMRA, we had the alignment of regulatory approaches. That little I refers to the workshop in early December, 3rd of December, and then a report which is being drafted now will come out at some point in February. And then in terms, you'll see then a few arrows just on ICMRA, what we're hoping, and there was a few questions on the international aspects. We are hoping then for further work. We haven't got any confirmation on that, but what I'd really like, and we would hope, is to use existing mechanisms, so PICS, IPRP, the International Pharmaceutical Regulatory Programme, to help develop guidance is, and maybe when the technology settles down, potentially maybe even ICH in the dim distance. So the arrows to the right of the technical and administrative guidelines shows that this is a process, not an event, and I'm really glad that you're with us on this journey. So the idea, as I mentioned, is that technology will move, process and products will come along that we haven't thought about yet. So those guidelines then will be updated, whether technical or administrative, as we move forward. So the next slide, please. So just to thank everybody for their very active involvement, lots of questions in all sorts of different areas. So thank you for that. And we're hoping that you'll continue with us on this journey. I'd say, just to reiterate, what we're talking about is a range of different things. So we've got the regulatory readiness, which we're, I wouldn't say done with the legislation, hopefully done, but now it is the interpretive documents, the technical and procedural guidance. We'll work with you through Innovation Office inquiries, scientific advice meetings on the technical readiness of the product. And the institutional readiness, this is a relatively new concept for many, where we will be working with some. And just to touch on one question, this will include NICE in the UK, Care Quality Commission, and so on, General Medical Council, so quite a wide and disparate range of other regulators. Let's say it's meant to be enabling and enduring. So we're at a particular point on our journey now. So please travel with us on this, and you'll hear a little bit more then. And invites will be sent out for the next key event, which will be the in-person workshop on the 12th of March. I think that's probably it for these slides. So I think I can hand over from here. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Jan, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate it if you could complete that and provide your feedback. You will also receive a follow-up email in the coming weeks with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. On behalf of MHRA and our presenters, thank you for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day.